Summer of 1878. Hayes Farm, Texas frontier. Let the boy go. Silas Vance stepped out of the barn, blood soaking through his shirt, his Winchester aimed straight at Coyle's chest. Clara dropped to her knees, clutching the battered 12-year-old Leo as tears streamed down her face. Coyle sneered, his hand hovering over his revolver. "You're bleeding to death. Stranger, you really think you can stop us?" Silas worked the rifle's lever with a chilling click. "Try me. Why would a wounded outlaw risk his life for a widow and a boy he'd never met? Stay with me until the end, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more unforgettable Western stories." The sun sat high over the Hayes farm that morning, and the dirt yard hadn't seen rain in 3 weeks. Clara Hayes wiped her hands on her apron and looked toward the road, where a plume of dust was rising fast. 3 riders. She counted them without meaning to. Old habit from the war, when counting men on a ridge could mean the difference between living and dying. Leo came running from the chicken coop, a basket of eggs swinging from his arm. "Miss Clara, someone's coming." "I see them, Leo. Get inside." He didn't move. 12 years old and stubborn as a mule. That boy, she'd raised him for 2 years now, ever since his folks died of fever. And in that time, she'd learned exactly how far his stubbornness could run. Today it ran straight past her. The riders pulled up at the fence line. Clara recognized the lead man, a broad-shouldered brute named Coyle, who worked for Thaddeus Blackwood. The other 2 she didn't know by name, but she knew their type well enough. Blackwood's men all had the same look, like dogs fed just enough to stay mean. "Mrs. Hayes." Coyle tipped his hat, though there was no respect in it. "Blackwood sends his regards." "Tell Mr. Blackwood I said no." Same answer as last time. He figured you'd say that. Coyle nodded to the man beside him, and everything happened fast after that. The second rider swung down off his horse and grabbed Leo by the collar before the boy could run. Leo yelled and twisted, trying to break free, and the man backhanded him across the face, hard enough to knock him flat in the dirt. Clara ran for him. The third rider blocked her path, his horse's shoulder shoving her back a step. "Sign the deed, Mrs. Hayes," Coyle said, calm as if he were talking about the weather. "Or the boy gets worse." The man on the ground hauled Leo up by his hair and drew back his fist again. Blood ran from the boy's nose. He wasn't crying, though it looked like it cost him everything not to. "Stop." Clara's voice cracked down the middle. "Stop, please. Sign it." She had no paper, no pen, nothing to sign. And it didn't matter one bit to Coyle. He wanted her broken before ink ever touched anything. So she dropped to her knees right there in the dirt, in front of the horses. Because sometimes a person has to make herself small to save what she loves. "I beg you," she said. "He's just a boy, please." The fist came down again. That was when the barn door groaned open. Nobody had looked at the barn all morning. Why would they? It was just an old building, leaning a little on its foundation, boards gone silver from years of sun. But a man had been lying up in the hayloft since the night before, a man with a bullet hole through his side and a fever building in his blood, and he'd heard every word said in that yard. Silas Vance had told himself he wouldn't get involved. He was a wanted man already, and trouble found wanted men twice as fast when they went looking for it. Rest one night, he'd figured, mend enough to ride, disappear before anyone knew he'd been there. Then he heard a woman begging for a child's life, and the plan stopped mattering. He came out walking slow, one hand pressed to the wound at his ribs, the other, holding a battered Winchester like it, weighed nothing at all. The lever cycled once, a sharp metallic clack that cut clean through the yard. Every one of Blackwood's men knew that sound in their bones. It meant a round was already chambered. It meant somebody meant business. "Let the boy go," Silas said. Coyle turned in his saddle, hand drifting toward his holster, then stopping when he saw the rifle leveled square at his chest. The midday sun threw Silas's shadow long across the dirt. Up close, a person could see the blood soaking through his shirt, dark against pale cotton, and still his face gave away nothing. Not fear, not pain, just a flat, dead-set stare that had seen worse mornings than this one. You're bleeding out. Stranger, Coyle said. You can't hardly stand. Try me, the man holding Leo hesitated. And that was all the boy needed. He twisted loose and scrambled toward Clara, who caught him and pulled him hard against her chest. Coyle's eyes moved from Silas to the woman and boy and back again. Men like him always ran the same math in the end, weighing his own skin against his boss's orders. And this time the math came up short. This ain't over, Coyle said, backing his horse away. Blackwood's got the law on his side. All you're doing is delaying it. Then I'll delay it with a rifle in your face every time you ride up this road. Silas kept the barrel steady. Now get off her land. The three riders wheeled around and spurred off, dust climbing behind them until the road swallowed them whole. Silas held the rifle level until they were nothing but a smudge on the horizon. Only then did his knees give out. Clara caught him before he hit the ground, though his weight nearly took her down with him. Up close now she could see the wound plain, an ugly puncture just below his ribs, black at the edges, left untended. Wounds like that killed a man slow. Who are you? She asked, though it hardly mattered right then. Nobody important. Silas managed. Just passing through. You're bleeding through my barn floor. Mister, that makes you my business now. She glanced back at Leo, who stood wide-eyed with blood still trickling under his nose. Leo, fetch my medical bag. And the clean linens from the chest. Quick as you can. Leo ran for the house without arguing, for once. Clara looked down at the stranger in her arms. This man who'd walked out of her barn half dead and put himself between her family and three armed riders without asking a single question first. She didn't know his name yet. Didn't know what he'd done to earn a bullet or a bounty. Didn't know one thing about him. But she knew what she'd just watched happen in her own front yard. A man close to dying had chosen, in the space of a single breath, to stand for a boy he'd never met and a woman he didn't know from any other. Whatever he'd run from, whatever had put that stillness in his eyes. He'd made his choice today, and it cost him more than it should have. Hang on, she told him, dragging him toward the porch steps. You saved that boy's life. I don't aim to let you lose yours over it. Silas fought to keep his eyes open, fixed on her face like it was the only steady thing left in a world that had started spinning. Ma'am, he whispered, I didn't do it for thanks. I know, Clara said. That's exactly why you're getting help. The sun kept climbing overhead, indifferent to the blood in the dirt or the debt now sworn between two strangers who'd known each other less than a minute. But something had shifted on the Hayes farm that morning, miles away, in his office in town. Thaddeus Blackwood had no idea it was already coming for him. The kitchen table wasn't built for surgery, but it was what Clara had, so it would do. She and Leo hauled Silas up onto it, and the man barely fought them, which told her more than any wound could. A conscious man fights. A man too far gone just lets himself be moved. Leo water. Boil it now. The boy ran. Clara peeled Silas's shirt back from the wound and got her first real look at it in daylight. The bullet had gone in below the ribs, angled, and hadn't come out the other side. That meant it was still in there, working its poison into him with every hour that passed. You've done this before, Silas said. His voice came out thin, stretched over gritted teeth, more times than I can count. Field hospital outside Chattanooga, 3 years running. She laid out her instruments on a clean cloth, the metal catching the light from the window. You hold still, or I tie you down. Your choice. Ma'am, I'm not in a position to argue with you. Good. Keep it that way. Leo came back with the pot, and Clara set to work washing her hands. Then the wound, then her instruments. Same as she'd done 100 times before, in a tent, with shells falling close enough to shake the canvas. Her hands didn't shake now either. They never had. Not once. Not even the first time. Silas watched her face while she worked instead of looking down at what she was doing to him. That was smart. Most men wanted to see. Seeing only made it worse. What's your name? She asked, probing gently at the wound's edge. He hissed through his teeth. Silas what? A pause, long enough that she looked up at him. Vance, he said finally. Silas Vance. She kept working. If the name meant something to her, she didn't let it show on her face, though it did mean something. She'd seen it printed on a poster nailed to the post office wall in town. Block letters under a rough sketch that hadn't done him justice or injustice either. Just gotten the jaw wrong. You're the one they're calling Coyote. That's what they call me. Wanted man. Yes, ma'am. For what? His jaw tightened. Desertion. Clara found the bullet with the tip of her forceps, and Silas's whole body went rigid under her hands. A low sound tearing out of him that he clearly tried to swallow and couldn't. Almost, she said, steady as ever. Leo, hold his shoulder down. Firm now, Leo leaned his full weight into it, small as he was. And Silas didn't buck against him, though the effort of holding still was written plain across his face. Sweat ran down his temple into the hay of his hair. His hands gripped the edges of the table, hard enough to whiten his knuckles. Desertion from what? Clara said, working the forceps deeper, keeping him talking, because talking men bled less panic into their bodies. She'd learned that in the war, too. Texas Rangers. The words came out clipped, broken up by his breathing. 5 years. Good years. Mostly. Then they gave us an order I couldn't follow. What order? Clear a valley of settlers. Mexican families. Been there longer than Texas was Texas. Captain called it a land dispute. Wasn't a dispute. Was a massacre with paperwork attached. Clara's hands didn't stop moving, but something in her face changed. A tightening the eyes that had nothing to do with the surgery. I refused the order, Silas went on, voice fraying at the edges. 3 of us did. The other 2 didn't walk away from that valley. I did. Rangers don't forgive that kind of refusal. Doesn't matter that I was right. Matters that I didn't obey. So you ran. So I ran. Clara found the bullet fully then and drew it out. A small, ugly piece of lead that had traveled a long way to end up in a stranger's side. She dropped it into a tin cup, where it landed with a sound too small for all the trouble it had caused. There, she said, the worst of it's over. Silas's breathing slowed, though his eyes had gone glassy, with the effort of staying conscious through it. You didn't have to do that. No, I didn't. Then why? Clara threaded a needle, wiping the wound clean before she started closing it. She thought about the question longer than the answer deserved, because the true answer was simple. And she wanted to say it right. Because you stood between a boy and 3 armed men when you had every reason in the world to stay hidden in that barn and let it happen. That kind of thing doesn't go unanswered where I'm from. You don't know me. I know what I watched you do. That's enough for today. She finished the stitches in silence, Leo watching from the corner with wide eyes, learning something about the world that no schoolbook would ever teach him. When Clara tied off the last thread, Silas's eyes had already slipped shut, his body finally allowing itself the rest it had been fighting for. Since the moment he stepped out of that barn, fever set in by nightfall. Clara expected it. Wounds that deep always brought fever. The body's own war against the damage done to it. She moved a cot into the front room, close to the hearth, and sat beside it with a basin of cool water and a rag, wiping his forehead down every time his skin ran hot enough to worry her. He talked in his sleep, fractured things, names she didn't know. Orders he was refusing all over again in whatever country his fever had dragged him back into. Once he said a name, Maria, and his hand clenched the blanket so hard his knuckles went white. Clara didn't ask who Maria was. Some things a person needed to keep, even from themselves. Around midnight, Leo came down in his nightshirt and sat on the floor beside her chair, knees pulled to his chest. Is he gonna die? I don't think so. Fever's bad. But the wound's clean now. Man his age. Strong as he looks. He's got a good chance. He didn't even know us. Why'd he come out of the barn like that? Clara looked down at Silas, at the sheen of sweat on his face, at the scar tissue she'd glimpsed on his forearms that spoke of a life, lived hard and violent long before today. Some folks carry a debt inside them they don't even know about until the moment comes to pay it, she said. I think Mr. Vance has been carrying his a long while. Today it came due. Leo thought about that with the seriousness only a 12-year-old boy can bring to a hard idea. Like paying for something you didn't buy, sort of. Except I think what he's paying for is something he refused to do. Sometimes doing the right thing costs a man just as much as doing the wrong thing would have. maybe more. That doesn't seem fair. No, Clara said. It doesn't. But fair's got nothing to do with right. Leo, best you learn that now instead of later. The boy leaned his head against her knee, and eventually his breathing evened out into sleep. Clara stayed awake a while longer, tending the fire and the fevered man both, until her own eyes grew too heavy to fight. He woke before dawn, lucid this time, the fever having broken sometime in the small hours. He found her asleep in the chair beside him, her head tipped back at an angle that would leave her neck aching. Come morning, he watched her for a long moment before he spoke. Mrs. Hayes. Her eyes opened at once. No grogginess in them. Another old habit from years of sleeping light in a war camp. You're awake, she said. Fever's down. That's good. You stayed up with me all night. Somebody had to keep the fire going. That's not what I meant. Clara straightened in the chair, rubbing at the crick in her neck. I know what you meant. Silas tried to sit up, and she put a hand flat on his chest. Not hard, just enough to remind him of the stitches holding his side together. Lie still. You're not going anywhere for a week at least. I should go before Blackwood's men come back with more of them. They won't be back today. Coyle's not fool enough to ride against a loaded rifle twice in 1 week without reinforcements. And reinforcements take time to gather in a county this small. She said it plainly, the way she might describe the weather, though there was steel underneath it. You go out that door in your condition. You'll be dead of infection before you make it 5 miles. And then whatever debt you think you owe me goes unpaid. I don't much care for unfinished business, Mr. Vance. He studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his tired eyes. You talk like a soldier. I served 3 years in an army hospital tent. I didn't carry a rifle, but I buried plenty of men who did, and I patched up plenty more who lived to fight another day. They didn't want to fight. I learned a few things in that time, such as. The law in a place like this can be bought clean through, same as anything else, with a price tag on it. Blackwood's got the sheriff in his pocket and half the county judges besides. A man with enough gold can buy himself a badge, a warrant, even a jury if it comes to that. She looked at him steady, unflinching, but a human life isn't for sale. Not to Blackwood, not to anybody. That boy upstairs is worth more than every acre of land Blackwood's trying to steal from me. And so are you, whatever that poster in town says about you. I didn't pull that bullet out of you because I expected payment, Mr. Vance. I did it because letting a man die on my porch after he saved my son isn't something I could live with afterward. That's the whole of it. Silas said nothing for a while. Outside, the first gray light of dawn was starting to creep along the horizon, turning the dark window pane the color of ash. I owe you, he said finally. Whatever you say about payment, I owe you a debt now. Blood debt, where I come from. That's not a small thing. Where you come from, maybe not. Here, all I want is for you to heal up and decide for yourself what you do next. If that means riding on, once you're strong enough, I won't stop you. If it means something else, well, she stood, smoothing her skirt, already moving toward the practicalities of the morning. The fire, the chickens, the day that didn't care one bit about the night that had passed. We'll see. She left him there in the gray light with his thoughts. And if Silas Vance had learned anything in his 35 hard years, it was that a debt like the one he now carried didn't get settled by riding away from it. It got settled by staying. 6 days passed before Silas could stand without the room tilting sideways on him. And by the 10th day, he was walking the fence line with a limp and a scowl, testing posts that had gone soft with rot. This whole eastern fence is coming down inside a month, he told Clara, kicking at a post that gave more than it should have. Coyle's men could ride straight through here without slowing their horses. I know it. Then why hasn't it been fixed? Clara set down the basket of eggs she'd been carrying, a flash of temper crossing her face. Because my husband's been dead 2 years, Mr. Vance. And fixing fence takes 2 sets of hands I haven't had since he passed. I've kept this place running on my own, with a 12-year-old boy's help. Forgive me if the eastern fence wasn't first on my list of worries. Silas had the grace to look chastened. Didn't mean it as a criticism. Didn't sound like anything else. I'm offering to fix it. That's all. Clara studied him a long moment. This man who 10 days earlier had been bleeding out on her kitchen table, and now stood arguing with her about fence posts like he'd lived on the place his whole life. Something about the ordinariness of the argument struck her as almost funny, though she didn't let herself smile at it. "Fine," she said. "Fix the fence, but you're still healing, so you take it slow. And the first sign you start bleeding through those stitches, you stop." "Yes, ma'am." They worked the fence together over the following days, Leo running lumber and nails between them, and it became, without either of them saying so, a kind of routine. Clara found she didn't mind the company. The farm had been quiet since her husband died, quiet in a way that pressed on a person after a while, and having two other voices in the house again, even one as guarded as Silas's, filled up some of that emptiness she'd stopped letting herself notice. It was on the fourth day of fence work that Silas brought up the rifle. He'd been cleaning the Winchester on the porch steps that evening, the parts laid out on a cloth in front of him, when he looked up at Clara sitting nearby shelling peas into a bowl. "You should learn to shoot." Clara didn't look up from the peas. "No, Blackwood's not done with you. You know that. Next time his men come, they might not stop at roughing up the boy. I won't always be standing close enough to step in." I said, "No, Mr. Vance." "Why not?" She set the bowl down then, and there was an edge in her voice when she answered that hadn't been there a moment before. "Because I spent 3 years in a field hospital sewing up what guns do to a man's body. I've held boys not much older than Leo while they died screaming for their mothers. Boys who picked up a rifle thinking it would protect them. And it didn't protect them one bit. It just made sure there was a body left behind for someone else to grieve over. I watched what guns do, up close, more times than I can count, and I decided, a long time ago, I wasn't going to be part of adding to that pile. Violence doesn't end violence. It just spreads it further. Sometimes it's the only thing that stops it. Is that what you tell yourself? Is that what got 2 of your friends killed in that valley you told me about?" The words landed harder than she meant them to, and she saw it cross his face. A flinch quickly buried. "That's not fair," he said quietly. "Maybe not, but you asked me why, and that's my answer. I've seen the cost of the gun up close, Mr. Vance, closer than most. I won't pretend it's some simple solution to a hard problem." Silas set the rifle parts down and looked at her steady across the porch. "I'm not asking you to become a gunslinger, Clara. I'm asking you to know how to protect that boy if the day comes I'm not here to do it. There's a difference between using violence to take something and using it to stop something worse. I think you know that difference better than most. Given what you did with your own hands 10 days ago, pulling a bullet out of me." Clara didn't answer right away. She looked out at the half-finished fence, at the cedar posts standing pale against the darkening sky, at the gap where the last section still needed closing. "I'll think on it," she said finally, which was as much ground as she was willing to give that night. They didn't finish the argument. Not that evening, and not the next. But something had shifted between them in the having of it, an honesty neither one had expected to find in the other. Clara began to understand that Silas's steadiness wasn't the absence of feeling. It was feeling held under a hard-won control. And Silas began to understand that Clara's gentleness wasn't weakness. It was a choice she made new every single day. Harder in some ways than pulling a trigger ever could be. The fence work continued into its second week, and each evening the light came down gold and heavy across the yard, catching the raw cedar of the new posts and turning them the color of embers. Clara found herself pausing more often than the work required, just to watch that light settle over the land, over Leo running lumber with his shirt untucked, over Silas working steady and quiet with his sleeves rolled to the elbow, the scars on his forearms catching the light too. One evening, with the last section of fence only half raised between them, Clara stood on her side of the gap and Silas stood on his, the unfinished cedar slats forming a rough lattice between them that the sunset poured straight through. "You're staring," Silas said, not looking up from the post he was setting. "I'm thinking about the fence, about a lot of things." She ran her hand along the top rail. "You could have left by now. You're strong enough to ride. I could have. Why haven't you? He straightened then, meeting her eyes through the gap in the fence. The gold light, catching half his face and leaving the other half in shadow. Told you. I owe a debt. That's not the whole answer. A long pause stretched between them, filled with the sound of Leo's hammer, somewhere off, toward the barn, and a mockingbird, working through its evening song in the cottonwood tree. No, Silas admitted. It's not the whole answer, but it's the only one I've got words for right now. Clara let that sit, understanding, in the way a person sometimes understands another without needing every piece of it spelled out plain, that there was more coming, in its own time. That understanding deepened 3 nights later, when Clara woke past midnight to the sound of the porch boards creaking under slow, steady weight. She rose and looked out her window to find Silas seated on the top step, the Winchester laid across his lap, his eyes fixed on the dark tree line at the edge of the property. She went down and found him there again the second night, and the third, always in the same posture, watching, waiting, giving up his own rest so hers could stay undisturbed. On the fourth morning, she asked him about it over coffee. You haven't slept in 3 nights. I've slept some. Silas. He looked up at the use of his first name, something crossing his face that he tried to keep from showing. You needed the rest, he said simply. You've been running this farm alone for 2 years, tending a wound-up outlaw for 2 weeks on top of it, and worrying about Blackwood's next move the whole while. Somebody needed to stand watch, so you could actually sleep through a night for once. Wasn't a hard decision to make. Clara sat down across from him at the table, studying his tired face in the morning light, the shadows under his eyes deep from 3 sleepless nights given freely for her sake. That's a debt already paid several times over. Mr. Vance wasn't keeping score. No, she said, something warm and unguarded slipping into her voice for the first time since he'd arrived. I don't suppose you were. Outside, Leo was already up chasing chickens back into their pen. The fence stood finished and pale gold in the morning sun, and for the first time in longer than Clara cared to admit, the farm felt less like a place under siege and more like something worth calling home again. The posters went up in town on a Tuesday. Clara heard about them before she saw them, from the widow Turner at the general store, who pulled her aside with a look of nervous pity that told Clara something was wrong before a single word passed between them. You'd best go look at the post office wall, dear, the widow said, before somebody else tells you about it worse than I'm about to. Clara went and looked. There, nailed up beside the older poster of Silas, was a new one, cruder in its printing, but unmistakable in its intent. Her own name sat under a rough likeness of her face. Wanted for harboring a fugitive. It read, and below that, in smaller letters, a reward figure large enough to tempt any man in the county, short on cash. She stood there a long while, reading her own name printed as a criminal's, feeling the eyes of the townsfolk on her back, some sympathetic, most simply curious, a few outright hostile in the way fear makes people hostile toward anyone standing too close to trouble. She rode home with her jaw set and told Silas plainly what she'd found. He's making sure nobody in town will help us now, Silas said, reading the description she gave him with a stillness that had gone hard and cold. Turns every neighbor into a possible bounty hunter. Smart, ugly, but smart. What do? We wait. Blackwood's not finished escalating. This is just the opening move. He was right, though it came sooner than either of them expected. 2 days later, a lone rider came up the farm road at a careful pace, hand held plainly away from his holster, a young deputy's badge catching the afternoon light on his vest. Silas stepped out onto the porch first, rifle held loose but ready at his side. That's far enough, he called out. The rider reined in at a respectful distance and lifted both hands slow, showing empty palms. Deputy Harlan Reed, I'm not here for trouble, mister. I've got a warrant to deliver, that's all. Whose warrant? Judge Caldwell's, out of the county seat. Harlan's voice wavered slightly on the name, a hitch Silas caught and filed away. For the arrest of Clara Hayes on charges of harboring a wanted fugitive. Clara came out onto the porch behind Silas, arms crossed, chin lifted, Judge Caldwell's never set foot on this property, nor spoken 2 words to me in his life. That warrant's a lie dressed up in official paper, and you know it." Deputy Harlan's eyes dropped. Just for a moment, before he forced them back up. "I'm just delivering what I'm given, ma'am. Doesn't matter what I think of it, doesn't it?" Silas said, stepping down off the porch. Closer now, though he kept the rifle pointed at the ground. No threat in his posture at all. Just a slow, deliberate walk that put him within arm's reach of the young deputy's horse. "You're what?" 22. 23. 23, Harlan said, thrown by the question. "You strike me as a man who took that badge because he wanted to do some good in this county. Am I wrong?" Harlan didn't answer right away, and that silence said more than any words could have. "I'll tell you what I know about badges," Silas went on, leaning now against the porch rail, his voice gone low and even. No shouting in it, nothing but a quiet certainty that seemed to carry further than any raised voice might have. "I wore one myself, once Texas Rangers, 5 years. Thought it meant something. Thought it meant I stood for something bigger than myself." He paused, letting that settle. "Then one day, my captain handed me an order to help clear a valley full of families off land Texas wanted for the railroad, and I understood real quick that a badge only weighs as much as the man behind it lets it weigh. Mine got heavy that day, heavier than I could carry. So I set it down." Harlan's horse shifted under him, but the young man himself sat very still, listening. "That tin star on your vest, deputy, it's not worth a thing on its own. Blackwood's had it forged in the blood of every family he's squeezed off their land, every widow he's threatened, every child he's had beaten in a farmyard to force a signature out of a grieving mother." Silas's eyes didn't waver from Harlan's face. "You ride up here and hand Mrs. Hayes a lie with a judge's name stamped on it. That badge gets a little heavier still. Question is how much weight you're willing to carry before it drags you under with him." The silence that followed stretched long across the yard, broken only by the wind moving through the new cedar fence and a mockingbird somewhere off in the trees, indifferent to the gravity of the moment below it. "I've got a mother in town," Harlan said finally, quiet almost to himself. "Blackwood holds the note on our house. Has for 2 years now. I took this job because he as good as told me he'd call it due if I didn't. That's the whole trick of a man like Blackwood," Clara said gently, stepping down to stand near Silas now. "He doesn't rule through strength, deputy. He rules through debt and fear, same as he tried with me and my boy. But debt only holds power over a man, so long as that man believes he has no other choice. You've got a choice standing right in front of you today." Harlan looked between the two of them for a long moment, the warrant still folded in the saddlebag at his hip, unused. "I can't tear it up," he said. "He'll know. He'll ask for it back." "Then don't tear it up," Silas said. "Just don't serve it. Ride back. Tell him you couldn't find grounds to make the arrest stick, that a judge worth his robes would never sign a warrant this thin if it ever got tested in open court. Buy us time. Buy yourself some, too, while you're at it. Time to figure what kind of man you want to be once this is all finished." The deputy sat his horse a long while, the weight of the choice plain on his young face. Years older in that moment than his 23 would suggest. Then, slow, he reached into his saddlebag and drew the folded warrant out, looking at it like it had suddenly grown heavier in his hand. "I never served this," he said. "Never even rode out here today. You understand me." "Understood," Clara said. Harlan tucked the paper back away, wheeled his horse around, and rode off down the farm road at a pace just short of a gallop. Dust rising behind him, same as it had the day Blackwood's enforcers first came calling. But this time the dust settled over a different kind of outcome. A small crack opened up in the wall Blackwood had built around this county, and both Clara and Silas, standing in the yard, understood exactly what they'd just watched happen. "He'll be back," Silas said, watching the dust settle. "Man like Blackwood doesn't let a failed warrant go unanswered for long." "I know. Next time might not end with words." Clara looked out at the cedar fence, finished now and pale gold in the afternoon light, at Leo watching wide-eyed from the barn door where he'd been listening the whole while, at the man beside her who'd once worn a badge himself and knew exactly what it cost to set one down for the sake of doing right. "Then we'll be ready," she said. "Same as we were ready for Coil. Same as we'll be ready for whatever comes after that." Silas nodded. Slow, and for the first time since he'd stumbled bleeding out of that barn 2 weeks earlier. Something in his face looked less like a man waiting to run and more like a man who had, without quite meaning to, found somewhere worth staying to defend. 3 weeks had passed since the deputy rode away with his warrant, still folded and unused. And in that time, the farm had settled into something Clara hadn't expected to find again. A rhythm. Mornings started with Silas already up and working before she came downstairs. Coffee going on the stove. The horses fed. Evenings ended with the three of them at the table, together. Leo talking a mile a minute about whatever he'd seen or built or chased that day. Silas mostly quiet, but listening close, adding a word here and there that made the boy light up like he'd been handed a prize. It wasn't peace exactly. Clara knew better than to call it that. Peace didn't come with a wanted man's rifle propped by the door and a widow's own face nailed to a post office wall in town. But it was something close enough to peace that she'd started letting herself enjoy it. And that's scared her more than Blackwood ever had. Because things a person enjoys are things a person can lose. The trouble announced itself 3 days before it arrived, though neither of them read the signs right at the time. Leo spotted the first rider from the hayloft, a lone man sitting his horse on the ridge to the east, watching the farm through the better part of an afternoon, before he finally turned and rode off. Silas climbed up to look for himself once Leo told him, and by then the rider was gone. Nothing left but hoofprints in the dry grass and a bad feeling that settled over the place like weather rolling in. "Scout," Silas said that evening, cleaning the Winchester at the table with more care than usual. "Blackwood's counting our numbers, checking the layout. He's building towards something. How long do we have?" "Not long. Days, maybe. He's done waiting on the law to solve this for him." Clara looked at Leo, who'd gone quiet in his chair, listening with the kind of stillness that told her he understood more of the danger than she wished he did. She reached over and put a hand on his shoulder, and he leaned into it without a word. "Then we get ready," she said. They spent the next 2 days preparing what they could. Silas checked every window and door for a clear line of sight, moved the woodpile to give better cover along the porch, and finally, on the second evening, set 2 loaded rifles by the back door where Clara could reach them without having to think twice. She didn't argue this time. Something about the scout on the ridge had changed her calculation, quiet and unspoken, though Silas noticed and said nothing about it either. Some lessons a person has to arrive at on their own timing. The attack came on the 3rd night, a little past midnight, under a sky with no moon in it at all. Silas woke first, some old instinct from his ranger years pulling him out of sleep before his ears had even caught the sound that caused it. He was at the window in 3 strides, rifle already in hand, and what he saw through the glass turned his blood to ice water. Torches, a line of them moving up from the tree line. 6 or 7 riders spread wide across the yard, and even as he watched, one rider drew his arm back and hurled something bright and burning, end over end, toward the barn roof. "Clara," his voice tore through the house. "Fire. Get Leo. Get to the cellar now." She was already moving before he finished the sentence, some part of her still tuned to the sound of danger from her war years. Snapping awake and steady in an instant, she grabbed Leo from his bed. The boy, startled and frightened but obedient, and the 3 of them made it to the front room just as the first lantern shattered against the barn's old dry wood, and the whole structure went up like it had been waiting years for exactly this moment. The fire moved fast, faster than Clara had ever seen wood burn, catching along the roof beams and racing down the walls in ropes of orange light, throwing a glow across the yard, bright enough to turn night into something like a violent dusk. She could hear the horses screaming inside, a sound that went straight through her and settled somewhere she wouldn't be able to shake for a long while after. Silas was already at the door. "The horses," he said. "I can get them." Silas, that whole roof could come down any second. They're going to burn alive if I don't. There wasn't time to argue it further, and both of them knew it. He went out the door and across the yard at a dead run, low against the light of the burning barn. Rifle left behind because there wasn't a fight to be found in flames. Only a choice between running toward danger or letting something helpless die in it. Clara pulled Leo back from the window, but couldn't stop watching herself, her heart slamming against her ribs as she lost sight of Silas in the smoke pouring off the barn's open door. Riders were circling the yard's edge, some hanging back at the fire's light, others firing wild shots toward the house that thudded into the porch boards and the wall beside the window Clara had just pulled Leo away from. "Get down," she told him, pushing him flat behind the heavy oak dresser they'd pulled in front of the window for exactly this purpose. "Stay down, Leo. Don't move till I say." She grabbed one of the rifles Silas had set by the back door and crouched at the window's edge, not shooting yet, just watching, waiting. Every instinct in her, screaming to go out after him, and every ounce of sense she had telling her that leaving Leo alone in a house under fire would be its own kind of disaster. Then she saw him, Silas, coming back out of the barn's collapsing mouth with two horses on lead ropes, smoke pouring off his clothes, one arm thrown up against the heat, rolling off the structure behind him. He got the animals clear just as a support beam gave way with a groan loud enough to hear over the rider's gunfire, the roof folding in on itself in a shower of sparks that lit the whole yard bright as day for one long, terrible second. A shot cracked out from the tree line and Silas staggered, though Clara couldn't tell in the chaos whether he'd been hit or had simply stumbled over the uneven ground. He didn't go down. He kept moving, dragging the horses toward the corral fence on the far side of the yard, out of the fire's reach. And Clara found herself breathing again. Only once she saw him get them secured and start back toward the house at a dead run. He came through the door coughing, smoke thick in his lungs, his shirt scorched black along one sleeve. "They're pulling back," he managed between coughs. "Fire's too bright. They don't want witnesses seeing faces this close to town. But the smoke's filling the house. We need lower ground, away from the heat." "The cellar," Clara said. They went down together. Leo first, then Clara, then Silas pulling the trapdoor shut behind them, sealing out the worst of the smoke that had begun creeping in under the front door. The root cellar was small and close, dug deep into cool earth, shelves of preserved vegetables lining walls that pressed in tight on all three of them. No window down there, no light either, once the trapdoor closed. Nothing but pitch dark and the muffled roar of the fire still burning somewhere above them. Leo found Clara's hand in the dark and gripped it hard. "Is it going to spread to the house?" "No," Silas said, his voice steady, even though his breathing still came ragged from the smoke. "Barn set off from the house by 30 yards, and the wind's blowing it away from us, not toward. House'll be fine. We just need to wait out the worst of the smoke." They sat in the dark a long while, the muffled crackle of the fire filtering down through the floorboards above, occasional shouts from the riders growing fainter as they finally gave up and rode off, satisfied, Clara supposed, with the destruction they'd already managed. Leo eventually slumped against her shoulder, exhaustion overtaking fear the way it does in children, his breathing slowing into something close to sleep, even in the middle of all that danger. Clara sat with her back against a shelf of canned preserves, the darkness so complete she couldn't see her own hand in front of her face, and became aware, gradually, of Silas sitting close beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat still radiating off his skin from the fire he'd run into twice over. "You're hurt," she said quietly, careful not to wake Leo. "Your arm." "It's nothing, just a scorch." "Let me see it." "Can't see anything down here." Clara. It was the first time he'd used her given name without the ma'am or Mrs. Hayes trailing behind it, and something in the dark of that cellar made the sound of it land differently than it might have in daylight. She found his arm in the dark, ran her fingers carefully along the sleeve until she found the place where the fabric had gone stiff and brittle with heat. You went in there twice, she said. You could have died in that fire. Couldn't leave them to burn. I know that. I'm not scolding you for it. Her voice caught, just slightly, before she steadied it again. I watched that roof come down not 20 feet from where you were standing. And I thought, that's it. That's the end of him. And I have never in my life felt so certain of losing someone in the space of one single second. Silas didn't answer right away. In the dark, she could hear him breathing, could feel the small movements of him settling closer, until his shoulder pressed against hers in the cramped space of the cellar. I thought about you the whole time I was in there, he said finally. Strange thing to think about, with a barn coming down around your ears. But there it was. Thought, if this beam catches me. At least I got the horses clear. At least Clara and the boy are safe in the house. Wasn't thinking about myself at all. Been a long while since I thought that little about my own hide. Why do you suppose that is? You know why? The dark pressed close around them, thick with the smell of smoke and damp earth, and the preserves lining the shelves. And somewhere above their heads, the fire was finally burning itself down toward embers, the roar fading to a low crackle that seemed almost peaceful now, compared to what it had been. Leo slept on against Clara's shoulder, undisturbed, and in the small, close quiet of the cellar. Something between the two adults sitting there had shifted past the point of pretending otherwise. Silas, yeah, I don't know what I'm doing. Letting myself feel this. You're a wanted man. This whole thing could end with you swinging from a rope in the county seat, or worse, and me right alongside you for harboring you this long. It's foolish, caring the way I've started caring. Maybe, he said, but foolishes never stopped a fire from burning, once it starts. I've been trying to talk myself out of this since the second week, telling myself I'd ride on once I healed enough. Spare you the trouble of a man like me hanging around your farm. Never managed to convince myself to actually do it. Why not? He was quiet a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped low, rough at the edges in a way that had nothing to do with the smoke, still sitting in his lungs. Because I haven't felt like a whole man in 5 years. Clara, not since that valley. I've been walking around with half of myself, buried out there with the people I couldn't save, going through the motions of living without ever really doing it. Then I ended up bleeding out in your barn, and you pulled a bullet out of me with your own 2 hands. And something about the way you did it, so calm, so certain, like saving a stranger's life was just an ordinary Tuesday to you. It started putting me back together in a way I didn't think was possible anymore. Clara found his hand in the dark and held it, her thumb tracing slow over his knuckles. I know something about being put back together, she said. Lost my husband 2 years ago. Fever took him in a week. Quick as that. No warning at all. I thought that was the end of feeling anything much, past just getting through each day for Leo's sake. Didn't expect to feel anything again. Not like this. And now I'm sitting in a root cellar in the pitch dark, half my barn burned to the ground, holding hands with an outlaw. And I can't remember the last time I felt this alive. He laughed, low and quiet, a sound she hadn't heard much of from him before. And it did something to her chest that she wasn't ready to name just yet in the dark. She felt him turn toward her, felt his free hand come up careful to find the side of her face, thumb brushing along her cheekbone with a gentleness that seemed at odds with everything she knew about the violence he'd lived through. Clara, he said, her name coming out almost like a question. Yes, that was all the answer he needed. He leaned in, and in the dark, with the smell of smoke still thick around them, and Leo sleeping soft against her shoulder. Silas kissed her, slow and searching at first. Then, with a certainty that had been building for weeks under the surface of fence posts and porch watches and quiet suppers at a kitchen table, Clara kissed him back, tasting ash and smoke on his lips, and something underneath that, something that tasted like survival itself, like 2 people who'd both nearly lost everything finding, against every reasonable expectation. A reason to hold on tighter to what remained, when they finally broke apart. Neither one spoke for a long moment. Above them, the fire had burned down to almost nothing, just a faint crackle of embers settling in the ruin of what had been a barn an hour before. I don't regret that, Silas said quietly. Neither do I. Blackwood's going to come again. Harder next time, I know. You still willing to see this through, knowing what it might cost you? Clara found his hand again in the dark and held it firm. I've been asking myself that question every day for 3 weeks now. Silas, I already know my answer. I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not asking you to either. Whatever comes next, we face it from here, together outside. The last of the fire finally died down to nothing but glowing coals. And somewhere in the dark, above them, the sky was already lightening toward a dawn that would show them, come morning, exactly how much they'd lost that night, and exactly how much, against everything reasonable, they'd found. Morning showed the damage plain and ugly. The barn was nothing now but a black skeleton of char and ash, a few beams still standing at broken angles, like ribs picked clean. Smoke still curling up, thin from the deepest embers, even hours after the fire itself had died. Clara stood in the yard, looking at it while the sun came up gray and pale behind a haze of drifting soot, and felt the loss of it settle into her slow. The way losses do once the emergency that caused them has passed, and there's nothing left to do but count the cost. We'll rebuild it, Silas said, coming to stand beside her. His voice still rough from the smoke he'd breathed in, twice over the night before. I know we will. She looked over at him, taking him in fully now in the daylight, and what she saw stopped her cold. His arm, the one she'd examined blind in the dark of the cellar, was worse than she'd realized. An angry burn running from wrist to elbow, blistered and raw where his sleeve had melted against the skin. Silas, that needs tending. Now, not later. It'll keep. It will not keep. Inside, sit down at the table. He didn't argue this time. Worn down enough by the night's events that fighting her on something so small didn't seem worth the effort. He sat at the kitchen table while Clara gathered her supplies, salve and clean linen and a basin of cool water, and set to work on the burn with the same steady hands she'd used to pull a bullet out of him weeks before. It was while she worked the sleeve fully off his shoulder, needing better access to the worst of the burn, that she saw his back for the first time in full daylight. She'd glimpsed pieces of it before, in passing. A scar, here or there when he'd been shirtless, doing fence work in the heat of the afternoon. But she'd never seen the whole of it laid out plain like this, and the sight of it stopped her hands mid-motion. His back was a map of old violence. Scars crossed over scars, some thin and pale with age, others thick and raised, pink against the tan of his skin. A long one ran diagonal from his left shoulder blade nearly to his spine. Smaller ones clustered near his ribs, the kind that spoke of a knife rather than a bullet, and low on his back, just above the waist. A cluster of puckered marks that Clara recognized from her years tending wounded soldiers. As the scars left behind by a whip, Silas, he went very still under her hands. Who did this to you? For a long moment he said nothing, his shoulders rigid, his breathing gone shallow and controlled in a way that told her he was holding something back with real effort. Some of it's from before the Rangers, he said finally, voice flat. My father wasn't a gentleman. Some of it's from the war, before that. And some of it, he paused, and Clara felt the muscles in his back tense further under her fingers. Some of it's from after, from the valley. Tell me. You don't want to hear it. I pulled a bullet out of your side with my bare hands. Silas Vance. I think I can handle hearing whatever it is you've been carrying around on this back of yours for 5 years. He was quiet a long while, long enough that Clara finished tending the burn and moved to sit across from him at the table instead, giving him room to find the words at whatever pace they'd come. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into something low and hollowed out. A man reading from a wound rather than a memory. Her name was Maria, he said, Maria Reyes. She and her family had worked that valley for 3 generations, since before Texas was even a state. Good people. Her father grew corn and beans on land his own father had cleared by hand. I'd gotten to know them some, doing patrols through that country. Maria used to bring water out to me and the other rangers when we rode through. No charge, just kindness. The way some folks are built for kindness without ever having to think about it. Clara said nothing, letting him find his way through it. The railroad wanted that valley. Blackwood's kind of men, back in Texas. They always want more land than they've got. So the captain got an order handed down. Framed up all official, said the Ray's family. And 6 others in that valley didn't hold clear title. Said it was government land being illegally occupied. And our job was to clear them off it, whatever it took. What did it take? Silas's jaw worked for a moment before he could get the rest out. 3 of us refused straight out. Told the captain we wouldn't do it. Not to families who'd done nothing, but farmed the same dirt their grandfathers farmed. He didn't take kindly to that. Had the other 2 shot for insubordination. Right there, in front of the whole company. To make an example, I only got away because I ran. That same night, while the camp was still reeling from what they'd just done to men I'd served beside for years. And the valley. They cleared it anyway, 3 days later, without us. I heard about it after, from a rider passing through the town I'd holed up in. Said it hadn't gone peaceful. Said there'd been fires, same as we had here last night, except nobody survived long enough to run for a cellar. His voice cracked on the last words, and he pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes. Hard, like he could push the memory back down by force. Maria didn't make it out. Neither did her little brother. 7 years old. I've carried that every single day since. Every time I close my eyes, I see that valley. See the smoke. Hear what I imagine it must have sounded like, though I wasn't even there to hear it for real. I ran instead. I saved my own skin and let good people burn because I was too much of a coward to stay and die trying to stop it. The confession broke something open in him that had clearly been sealed, shut a long while, and Clara watched a man built from steel and stillness come apart at her kitchen table, his shoulders shaking. Years of guilt finally finding a way out through the cracks he'd spent 5 years trying to hold closed. I'm not a good man. Clara, he said, voice raw. I tell myself I did the right thing refusing that order, but a good man would have found a way to warn them, would have ridden ahead and gotten them clear before the others came. I just ran. I've been running ever since, one town to the next, never staying long enough for anyone to see what kind of monster is really underneath all this. Clara came around the table and knelt in front of him, taking both his hands in hers, forcing him to look at her instead of down at the floor where his shame had pinned his eyes. Listen to me, she said, steady and clear. No room in her voice for argument. You refused an order to slaughter innocent people. You watched 2 friends die for making that same refusal, and you still didn't back down from it. That is not the choice of a coward. Silas, that is the hardest choice a man can make, choosing his conscience over his own safety, knowing full well what it might cost him. I still ran. I still left them to die. You were one man against an entire company under armed orders. If you'd ridden back into that valley alone, you'd have died right alongside them, and there'd have been nobody left at all to carry what happened. Nobody left to refuse the next order that came down. Nobody left to become the man who walked out of my barn 3 weeks ago and put himself between a boy and 3 armed men without a second thought. Don't you see it? Silas, every person you've protected since then, every kindness you've shown this family, that's Maria's memory living on through you. That's what refusing to become the monster they wanted you to be actually looks like. Carried forward, still doing good in the world. 5 years later. He shook his head, unconvinced, tears finally spilling over that he made no effort to hide from her anymore. It doesn't erase what happened to her. Nothing erases that. No, Clara agreed. It doesn't erase it. Nothing ever will. And I won't sit here and tell you it should. But I will tell you this, because I learned it the hard way in a war tent, full of dying boys who'd all made their own impossible choices. Some good, some terrible. Most somewhere murky in between. The past cuts us, Silas. Every one of us carries scars from choices we made or didn't make. Moments we'll spend the rest of our lives turning over, wondering if we could have done better, but we get to choose. Every single day going forward, whether that cut becomes a scar we carry forward, or stays a wound we let bleed us dry for the rest of our lives. You've been letting it bleed for 5 years. I'm asking you to let it scar instead. Let it become part of the man you are now. The man who ran into a burning barn twice to save 2 horses. The man who sat awake 3 nights running so I could finally sleep. The man who talked a scared young deputy into choosing his conscience over his fear. That man is not a monster. Silas Vance. That man is exactly the kind of good this county needs right now. And I will not sit here and let you believe otherwise. Silas looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. The weight of 5 years starting, just barely, to loosen its grip. How do you do that? He asked, voice still rough but steadier now. How do you take something that ugly and find a way to hand it back to me lighter than I gave it to you? Practice, Clara said, a small tired smile finally breaking through. I spent 3 years telling boys dying in my arms that their sacrifice meant something, because it needed to be true, and because most of the time, if you look hard enough, it actually was true. You're not dying in my arms. Silas, you're very much alive, sitting at my kitchen table with a burned arm and a healed conscience, if you'll let yourself have it. He pulled her into him then, careful of her hands still resting in his, and held her a long while in the quiet of that kitchen, the smell of smoke still clinging to both of them from the night before, the ruin of the barn, visible through the window behind him. And somewhere underneath all of it, something new taking root that neither the fire nor the 5 years of guilt had managed to burn away. Outside, Leo was already picking through the ashes of the barn, salvaging what tools he could find among the wreckage. A boy's practical mind already moving toward rebuilding, while the adults inside worked through the harder rebuilding that happens in a person's chest. And somewhere across the county, in an office that smelled of cigars and unearned power, Thaddeus Blackwood was already planning his next move. Certain the fire had broken something on the Hayes farm that couldn't be mended. He had no idea what he'd actually done was give 2 broken people one more reason to fight for each other. And, for everyone else in that county, still waiting on someone brave enough to stand against him. The blast came from 4 miles east, and Clara felt it before she heard it. A low shudder through the ground, the kind that rattled the water in a bucket, without anyone touching it. Leo dropped the hammer he'd been swinging at a new fence post and looked up. What was that? Blasting powder, Silas said. He was already moving toward the corral. Blackwood's railroad crew. They cut through the ridge with dynamite when the grading gets too steep for hand tools. That sounded bigger than usual. It did. Clara had heard blasting before, distant and dull. Background noise to a county that never stopped chewing up land for track. This one had a wrongness to it, a second crack that came too close on the heels of the first, like an echo that wasn't an echo at all. She saddled her horse without deciding to. Some habits from the war didn't ask permission. When something sounded like men in trouble, her hands moved before her mind caught up to them. Clara, I'm going to look. That's Blackwood's camp. His men shoot first and ask questions never. Then you'll have to come with me and make sure they don't. Silas studied her a moment, jaw tight, and didn't argue further. He whistled for his own horse and swung up, wincing only slightly where the burn on his arm still pulled tight under his sleeve. Leo started toward the barn that wasn't there anymore, looking for his own mount out of habit before he remembered. You stay, Clara told him. I can help. You can help by keeping this place standing while we're gone. Somebody has to. It wasn't a lie exactly, though both of them knew the real reason. Leo was quick and brave, braver than any 12-year-old had business being. But Clara had already watched 2 people she loved get hurt on account of Blackwood, and she wasn't riding toward a fresh disaster, with a third close enough to lose. They rode hard toward the smoke, rising thin and gray against the pale sky, and what they found when they crested the last hill stopped Clara's breath in her chest. The railroad camp sat in a shallow cut through the ridge, and half that cut had come down. A wall of loose rock and dirt had slid across the grading site where a crew had been working. Dozens of men buried under rubble that stretched 100 feet or more. Some were already clear, staggering, coughing dust, dragging at loose stone with bare hands. Others weren't moving at all. A few voices called out from under the debris. muffled and desperate, the kind of sound that carried straight through a person's ribs, no matter how many times they'd heard it before. Blackwood's foreman stood off to one side. Three of them, watching, not digging, watching. Clara didn't wait for Silas. She was off her horse before it fully stopped, medical bag already swinging off the saddle horn, running toward the nearest buried man with her skirt bunched in one fist. "Why aren't you digging?" she shouted at the foreman, the oldest of them, a heavy-set man with a tin star pinned crooked to his vest, one of Blackwood's private badges rather than any real law. Spat into the dirt. "Not our job to dig out wetbacks. Ma'am, company sent word. These men ain't worth the time. There are people dying under that rock. There's Mexicans and Chinamen under that rock. Company's got insurance for the track, not for the labor. Ain't nobody's business, but Blackwood's what happens to men he hired cheap enough to lose without missing the money." Clara felt something go cold and clear in her chest, the same feeling she used to get in the war tent when a surgeon told her a boy wasn't worth the ether because he'd likely die anyway. She'd never once listened to that kind of talk then, and she wasn't about to start now. "Get out of my way," she said, and walked straight past him toward the rubble. She knelt beside the nearest voice, a young man half buried to the chest, and started clearing rock with her hands, calling instructions over her shoulder to anyone within earshot who'd listen. A few of the standing survivors came to help, hesitant at first, then faster, once they saw a white woman in a widow's dress digging alongside them without a moment's pause for the color of the men she was pulling free. The foreman, with the crooked star, didn't like that one bit. "Ma'am, I'm telling you to step back from that, and I'm telling you there are men bleeding to death under your feet. This is company land. You got no business here." Clara ignored him and kept working, tying off a gash on a laborer's forearm with a strip torn from her own petticoat, moving to the next man before the knot was even fully cinched. The foreman's face went red, the kind of red that came right before a man reached for something he shouldn't. He drew his revolver. I said, "Step back." Every man near the rubble froze. Clara straightened slow, her hand still red with someone else's blood, and looked the foreman dead in the eye, without an ounce of the fear she probably should have felt. "You're going to shoot an unarmed widow in front of 30 witnesses. I'm going to shoot whoever don't follow company orders on company land." A shot cracked out then, sharp and sudden, and dirt kicked up hard right beside the foreman's boot. He jumped back with a curse, revolver swinging up toward the sound, and found nothing to aim at. The shot had come from high on the canyon ridge above the camp, too far and too well hidden for any return fire to matter. Clara didn't need to look up to know who it was. She looked anyway, and there he sat, prone against a shelf of rock 200 yards up, the Winchester's barrel just visible in the sun, steady as a fence post. "Next one won't miss your boot." Silas's voice carried down, calm and unhurried, the kind of calm that scared men more than shouting ever could. "Put the gun down and let the woman work." The foreman looked from the rifle on the ridge to his own men, none of whom seemed eager to test whether the next shot really would miss. Slow, muttering something under his breath, he lowered the revolver and holstered it. "This ain't over," he said, echoing words Clara had heard from Coyle weeks before. The same tired threat men like Blackwood's crew always reached for when they'd run out of anything better. "It's over for today," Clara said. "Now either help me dig or get out of my way. Those are your only two choices." He didn't help, but he didn't stop her either, and that was enough for the moment. Clara worked through the rest of the afternoon, pulling men free, splinting a shattered leg, packing a head wound tight enough to slow the bleeding until it could be stitched proper. She lost track of how many hands passed through her own, how many faces she looked into that were scared half out of their minds, and grateful past words for a stranger who'd ridden 4 miles because a blast sounded wrong. By the time the sun dropped low and orange over the ridge, 7 men had been pulled out alive who likely wouldn't have survived the night otherwise. 3 hadn't made it, buried too deep or hurt too bad before anyone reached them, and Clara knelt by each of those 3, long enough to say something quiet. she didn't share with anyone else, an old habit from the war tent that never quite left her. Silas came down off the ridge once the foreman finally gave up and rode back toward town to report to Blackwood. Whatever version of the story they intended to tell him, he found Clara sitting in the dirt beside the last of the wounded, blood dried dark on her hands and forearms, exhaustion carved deep into her face. "You did good today," he said, crouching beside her. 3 men died who might not have, if those foremen had lifted a single finger sooner. You saved 7 who'd have died for certain otherwise. That's not nothing. Clara, she looked up at him, at the rifle still slung over his shoulder, at the steady watchfulness that never quite left his eyes even now. You were up on that ridge the whole time, watching, every second. Why didn't you come down and help me pull rock? He considered the question a moment, the kind of consideration that told her the answer mattered to him. Because from up there, I could see every man on this site who might have decided to stop you with a bullet instead of an argument. Down here, digging, I'm one more set of hands. Up there, I'm the reason nobody tried what that foreman almost tried twice. He nodded toward the man with the crooked star. Now nothing but a shrinking shape on the road back toward town. Sometimes protecting somebody doesn't look like standing right next to them. Sometimes it looks like making sure nothing bad happens from 200 yards off, where they never even have to know you were the reason it didn't. Clara thought about that, about all the ways a person could stand guard over what they loved without ever needing thanks for it, and found she understood the shape of it better than she once might have. Blackwood's going to hear about this by morning, she said. He's going to hear his own foreman drew a gun on an unarmed woman helping his own laborers, and got backed down by a rifle he couldn't even see. That's not a story that makes him look strong. Clara, men like Blackwood care more about looking strong than almost anything else. This is going to eat at him. Good, Clara said, and meant it with a fierceness that surprised even her. Let it eat at him. Every one of those men under that rock was worth just as much as any railroad executive sitting comfortable in an office in town. If Blackwood can't stomach a story where that turns out to be true in front of 30 witnesses, that's his own conscience failing him, not mine. They rode home slow in the last of the daylight, tired in the particular way that comes from work that matters, the kind of tired a person can actually rest inside of, instead of just enduring. Leo met them at the gate, worry plain on his face until he saw them both upright and whole. "I heard the shot," he said, "from way out here. Thought maybe we're fine," Clara said, swinging down off her horse with muscles that had already started to ache. "Long day. I'll tell you about it over supper that night, over a meal thinner than it should have been on account of the barn, and everything stored in it now gone to ash." Clara told Leo what had happened at the railroad camp, leaving out none of the hard parts, because she'd decided somewhere along the last 2 months that a boy who'd already seen his own blood in the dirt deserved the truth plain rather than softened. "Those foremen just watched people die?" Leo asked. His young face twisted with the particular outrage children carry before the world teaches them to expect less of it. "They did. That's not right." "No," Clara agreed, "it's not. And I want you to hold on to that feeling you've got right now. Leo, that fire in your chest telling you it's wrong. A lot of grown men lose that feeling somewhere along the way, talk themselves into believing some lives are worth less than others because it's easier or more profitable to believe that than to fight it. Don't you ever let yourself lose it." "I won't. I know you won't," she said, and reached over to squeeze his hand, proud of him in a way that went past words. Across the table, Silas watched the 2 of them with something unguarded in his face, the look of a man who'd spent 5 years believing himself unfit for anything gentle. Slowly, that wasn't true at all. Word of the railroad camp reached Thaddeus Blackwood by breakfast the next morning, and it reached him wrong, though not in the way his foreman had hoped. The Crooked Star foreman told it as a story about an outlaw's woman making trouble on company land, expecting his employer to share his outrage over the interference. Instead, Blackwood sat behind his wide oak desk, listening to the account with a stillness that unsettled the foreman more than any shouting would have. 30 witnesses, you said. About that many, sir. Laborers, mostly. And every one of them watched Mrs. Hayes pull their friends out of the rubble while your men stood by doing nothing. Company policy. Sir, we don't what the policy is. I wrote the policy. Blackwood stood slow, walked to the window, overlooking the main street of town, hands clasped behind his back. The problem, you fool, is that 30 men now have a story to tell every other laborer on this line. A story about a widow who treated them like they mattered when my own foreman wouldn't lift a finger. That's not a story that keeps men working scared and quiet. That's a story that gives them courage. The foreman said nothing, sensing correctly that nothing he offered would help him now. Get out, Blackwood said, and the foreman went, grateful to escape with nothing worse than a dismissal. Alone, Blackwood stood a long while at the window, watching the ordinary business of the town continue below him. Wagons and horses and townsfolk who had no idea how close their whole county sat to the edge of something. He'd built this operation on debt and fear, on quiet arrangements with judges and a sheriff who owed him more than he could ever repay, honestly. A widow with steady hands and an outlaw with a rifle threatened to unravel all of it, not through violence, but through something far more dangerous. Sympathy, loyalty, the kind of story that spread on its own, person to person, without needing Blackwood's permission at all. He needed the ledger secured, he decided. The true one. The one that recorded every debt he'd manufactured, every deed he'd stolen through manufactured claims, every bribe paid to keep the county's judges looking the other way. If word of that ledger ever got loose, no amount of fear would hold this county together for him anymore. He did not know, standing at that window, that his own deputy had already made up his mind. Harlan Reed had ridden away from the Hayes farm 3 weeks earlier, a changed man, though the change had taken its time, settling into something he could act on. He'd gone back to his duties, back to the small daily indignities of working for Blackwood, collecting fees and delivering notices, and looking the other way when the tycoon's men did things no honest lawman should ignore. Each day had worn a little more at the wall he'd built around his conscience, and the story of Clara Hayes at the railroad camp, which reached him same as it reached everyone in town by mid-morning, finished tearing that wall down entirely. He waited until Blackwood left the office that evening for his usual supper at the hotel, then let himself into the back room where the real books were kept, the ones that never saw daylight in any courtroom. He'd seen Blackwood work that's safe often enough to have memorized the combination without ever meaning to. A small mercy of habit that now mattered more than anything else he'd learned in 2 years of employment. The ledger was heavier than he expected, thick with pages of names and figures, deeds transferred under threat, loans issued at rates designed to be impossible to repay, judges and a sheriff listed by name alongside the exact sums paid to keep them quiet. It was. Harlan understood immediately. Enough to hang Thaddeus Blackwood from the nearest tree, if the county still had honest men left to try him. He tucked it inside his coat and left through the alley, heart hammering hard enough that he was certain every person on the street could hear it. The storm came up fast that night. The kind of sudden, violent weather the planes threw at a person with no warning at all. Black clouds rolling in low and heavy just as Harlan cleared the edge of town. Rain came down in sheets thick enough to blur the road ahead of him, and thunder cracked close enough to spook his horse twice before he'd gone even a mile. He should have waited it out. He knew that even as he pushed his horse harder through the downpour, mud sucking at the animal's hooves, lightning, throwing the whole landscape into sharp, white relief every few seconds. But something in him understood. With the clear, cold certainty a person sometimes gets in the middle of doing something dangerous, that waiting wasn't a luxury he had anymore. Blackwood would notice the ledger missing before morning. Harlan needed to reach the Hayes farm and put that evidence into hands that would actually use it, before Blackwood's men came looking for whoever had taken it. They found him 2 miles short of the farm. He never saw them coming. Not in that rain. Not with thunder swallowing every other sound. The first shot took him high in the shoulder, spinning him half out of the saddle. The second, the one that mattered, caught him square in the back as his horse bolted forward in panic, carrying him another quarter-mile before his grip finally failed and he went down hard in the mud at the edge of the farm road. He crawled the rest of the way. Clara heard the pounding at the door through the storm, a weak, uneven sound that took her a moment to recognize as knocking rather than the wind. She opened it to find Harlan Reed collapsed half across her threshold, soaked through with rain and blood both, his deputy's vest torn where a bullet had gone through the back of it and out somewhere near his ribs. Silas, he was there in seconds, hauling Harlan the rest of the way inside, while Clara already had her medical bag open. Though one look at the wound told her everything, her hands would only confirm a moment later. The bullet had passed clean through, taking too much with it on the way. Harlan, look at me. Clara pressed a folded cloth hard against the wound, though she already knew, the way she'd known with too many soldiers before him. That pressure wasn't going to be enough this time. His eyes found her face, glassy but focused, fighting to stay present against a tide that was already pulling him under. Ledger, he managed. Coat. Blackwood's ledger. Everything's in there. Every deed. Every bribe. Every name he's paid off. His hand fumbled weakly at his soaked coat, and Silas reached in and drew out the thick bundle of pages, water-stained but intact, the ink smeared in places but legible enough to matter. You got this out of his safe, Silas said, understanding hitting him at once. Had to. Harlan's breath came shallow now, wet, in a way that told Clara the bullet had done worse damage than she could fix with linen and pressure alone. Watched Clara at that camp. Watched her treat men like they mattered when nobody else would. Couldn't keep pretending I didn't know what Blackwood really was after that. You're going to be fine, Clara said, though her voice wavered on the lie. And Harlan's tired eyes told her he knew it too. No, ma'am, I don't think I am. He managed something close to a smile, faint and sad. But it's all right. Man's got the right to choose doing right, even at the end. Especially at the end, maybe. I chose it. That's worth something, isn't it? It's worth everything, Clara said, her own voice breaking now, tears mixing with the rain still dripping off her from the doorway. Harlan, it's worth everything. Get that ledger to the circuit judge, he said, each word costing him more than the last. Judge Ellery, out of Prescott. He's honest, not bought like Caldwell. Ellery will read what's in there, and he'll come. You get that to him, and everything Blackwood's built comes down. We will, Silas said, kneeling now beside Clara, his hand steady on Harlan's shoulder. I swear it. This debt gets paid. What you did tonight doesn't go for nothing. Harlan's eyes drifted to Leo, who stood frozen in the doorway to the front room, watching a man die on the floor of the only home he had left. Old enough now to understand exactly what that meant. Boy, Harlan whispered, you remember this. Remember, a man can spend years doing wrong before he finally does one thing right. Don't wait as long as I did to choose your side. Leo nodded, unable to find words, tears already running silent down his face. Harlan Reed died a few minutes later, there on the floor of the Hayes farmhouse, rain still hammering the roof above him and thunder still rolling low across the plains outside. Clara held his hand until the very end, the way she'd held the hands of so many dying men before him, offering what comfort she could, against a debt none of them should have owed in the first place. Nobody spoke for a long while after. Silas sat back on his heels, the ledger held loose in his hands, its weight far greater than the paper it was printed on. Leo cried quiet in the corner, the kind of crying a boy does when he's learning. Too young. That goodness sometimes costs everything a person has to give. He didn't have to do this, Clara finally said, voice thick. No, Silas agreed. He didn't. But he did it anyway. That's what redemption actually costs. Clara, nobody gets to buy it cheap. Harlan just paid the highest price there is. He looked down at the ledger again, at the names and figures that would finally see daylight in a courtroom that mattered. We make sure it counts. We ride for Judge Ellery at first light, storm or no storm, and we make sure every bit of what Harlan gave up tonight actually means something. Outside, the storm was already beginning to break, the thunder rolling further off, the rain softening toward something gentler. Dawn was still hours away, but the first hint of it already waited on the far edge of the sky, patient and certain. The way morning always comes, regardless of how dark the night before it happened to be. Judge Ellery read the ledger by lamplight for the better part of 2 hours before he said a single word. Clara and Silas sat across from him in a cramped office in Prescott, mud still drying on their boots from the ride, and neither one spoke either. There wasn't anything to say that the ledger didn't already say better. Page after page of stolen deeds, names of families run off their land, a column of numbers next to Judge Caldwell's name that made Ellery's jaw go tight every time he turned to it. Finally, he closed the book and set his hand flat on top of it, like he was holding something down that wanted to get up and move on its own. This is enough to end him, Ellery said. More than enough. But it's not going to happen quiet, and it's not going to happen fast. Blackwood's got money in this territory that reaches further than my courtroom. I'll need federal marshals. That means riding to the Capitol, means telegrams, means days you two might not have. How many days? Silas asked. 3, maybe 4 if the wire lines are behaving. Clara looked at Silas, and neither one needed to say what they were both thinking. 4 days was a long time for a man like Blackwood to sit still once he realized his ledger had walked out of his own safe. We'll hold the farm, Clara said. Ellery studied her a moment. The kind of look a man gives someone he's already decided to respect. Mrs. Hayes, if Blackwood works out, who took that book? And I expect he already has a good guess. He's not going to wait around for due process to catch up to him. He'll come at you with everything he's got left before the marshals ever arrive. Then we'll be ready when he does. They rode back to the farm the next morning under a sky that looked wrong from the moment the sun came up. Silas noticed it first, a color to the horizon that didn't belong there. A kind of brown-red haze, low and thick, where blue sky should have been. Storm coming, he said. Not rain. Dust. How bad? Bad enough that a man out in it can't see his own hand. Bad enough Blackwood might use it, for exactly the reason a smart man would use it. Cover. They pushed the horses harder the rest of the way home. Leo had the animals already moved into the corral behind the house by the time they arrived. Tarps lashed down over anything that might blow. Water barrels topped off and dragged close to the porch. 12 years old, and the boy had learned to read trouble faster than most grown men Clara had known in her life. I heard it on the wind an hour ago, Leo said. Sounded different than regular weather. You did good, Silas told him, and meant it. They spent what daylight remained checking every rifle in the house, counting shells, moving what furniture they could in front of the windows without blocking a clear line of sight. Clara laid out her medical bag on the kitchen table, the same as she had the very first night. Silas came bleeding out of the barn, because some things a person just knew to expect by now. The dust storm hit an hour before sundown. It came in low across the plain first, a wall of red-brown haze that swallowed the horizon whole. And within minutes, the wind had picked up enough to rattle every loose board on the property. Clara stood at the window, watching it roll closer, and felt something cold settle over her that had nothing to do with the temperature. They'll come with it, she said. They'll come with it, Silas agreed. He was right. Within the hour, the wind screaming loud enough now to swallow most other sound. A line of riders appeared out of the haze. More men than Clara had ever seen ride onto her property at once. She counted without meaning to. Same old habit from the war. And stopped counting somewhere past 20. Because past a certain number, it quit mattering how many exactly. Only that there were far more of them than there were of her and Silas put together. Thaddeus Blackwood himself rode at the front, wrapped in a long coat against the wind, his face set hard as stone. Vance. His voice carried thin and distorted through the storm. You've got something of mine. I want it back, and I want the woman who helped steal it. Silas stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, squinting against the grit. already stinging his eyes. Ledger's already gone. Blackwood, riding to the Capitol right now with a federal judge's blessing behind it. Whatever you do here tonight, it's already too late to matter. Then tonight's just for spite, Blackwood shouted back and raised his arm. The first shots came a heartbeat later, and everything after that dissolved into chaos. Clara had been in battle before, tending the wounded from a safe distance behind the lines. But she had never stood inside one, never felt what it meant to have the air itself full of noise and grit, and the whip-crack sound of bullets, finding wood too close to where she stood. She pulled Leo down behind the overturned kitchen table. They dragged to the window and pressed his head low with one hand while she fired with the other, not aiming to kill, just aiming to keep heads down and horses spooked. Silas fought like something out of a nightmare Blackwood's men would carry the rest of their lives, if they lived long enough to carry anything. He moved along the porch rail, firing and reloading with a speed that came from 5 years of ranger training, dropping 2 riders from their saddles before the rest even understood where the shots were coming from through the blowing dust. But even a man that skilled only carried so many shells, and the fight had barely stretched past its first 10 minutes before his rifle clicked empty in his hands. He was out. He ducked behind a support post as bullets chewed splinters out of the wood beside his head, patting his coat for shells that weren't there anymore, and understood in that moment, with a clarity that came fast and cold, that he had nothing left to fight with. Silas, Clara's voice cut through the wind. I'm out. I'm cornered. 3 of Blackwood's men were already moving toward the porch, sensing the gap in the defense, their own guns raised. Silas pressed himself against the post, empty rifle held like a club because it was all that remained to him. And for one long, terrible second, it looked like the whole fight might end right there in the dust and the dark. Clara didn't think. She'd spent 3 years training herself not to think in moments like this, only to act. Because thinking cost time that dying men never had. She left the window, snatched a fallen rifle from the porch floor, where one of Silas's earlier shots had put a man down beside it, and stepped out into the storm. The wind hit her like a wall, tearing at her hair, throwing grit into her eyes hard enough to sting tears loose. She could barely see 10 feet in front of her. The whole yard, nothing but shapes moving through a haze the color of dried blood. But she didn't aim at any of those shapes. She had told Silas once, weeks ago on a half-built fence line, that she wasn't going to be part of the pile of bodies guns left behind. And she meant to keep that promise even now, even with everything on the line. She swung the rifle toward the supply wagon parked at the edge of the yard, the one loaded down with the kerosene Blackwood's men had brought to finish what the barn fire hadn't, and she fired. The shot cracked out sharp even against the roaring wind, and for one held breath, nothing happened at all. Then the wagon went up. The explosion came low and heavy, a deep boom that Clara felt in her chest before her ears even caught up to it, and a wall of orange flame tore upward into the dust storm, throwing light across the whole yard bright enough to turn night into something like a burning noon. The blast knocked 2 riders clean off their horses. The rest scattered, animals screaming and rearing away from the fire, men fighting for control of mounts that wanted no part of what had just happened. The flames climbed high enough to physically split the yard in 2, a wall of fire, standing between Blackwood's remaining men and the farmhouse, the wind driving the smoke sideways in a thick black curtain that swallowed everything on the far side of it. Silas used the chaos. He grabbed a fallen rifle from one of the men Clara's shot had thrown from his horse, checked the chamber, and came up firing at the shapes still visible through the gaps in the smoke, dropping another rider, then another, until the remaining few broke and scattered wide around the fire rather than risk crossing through it. Blackwood himself sat his horse at the edge of the flames, his face lit orange and furious, screaming orders that the wind tore apart before they reached anyone able to obey them. Finish it, he shouted. Burn the whole place down if you have to. Nobody moved to obey him. His men had already seen enough. a wall of fire standing where a supply wagon used to be, 2 dead already in the dirt, and a woman standing in the open with a rifle who clearly wasn't afraid to use it exactly where it would hurt him most. Men who fight for money only fight so long as the money still seems worth the risk. And the risk had just climbed higher than any of them wanted to carry. One by one, they wheeled their horses and rode off into the storm, leaving Blackwood alone at the edge of the fire, shouting after them, his cracking with a fury that had nowhere left to land. Silas stepped down off the porch, rifle leveled, and walked toward him through the settling smoke. It's over. Blackwood, nothing's over. I own 3 judges in this territory. I own the sheriff. I'll have new men out here inside a week. You won't, Silas said. That ledger's already past Prescott, headed for the Capitol with federal marshals coming behind it. Every judge you own, every dollar you've paid to keep this county quiet, it's all in there. Names and figures both. You can ride off into this storm right now if you want. But there's nowhere in this territory left for a man like you to hide once that book gets read out loud in a courtroom. Blackwood sat his horse a long moment, the fire behind him, throwing his shadow long and broken across the yard. And something in his face finally cracked. The certainty of a man who'd never once believed the world could actually hold him accountable for anything. He didn't run. Maybe he understood, in that final moment, that running wouldn't change what was already coming for him. He simply sat there, watching the flames die down slow against the wind, waiting for whatever came next, the same way a man waits out a storm he no longer has any power to stop. Clara came to stand beside Silas, the rifle still loose in her hands, her whole body shaking now that the fight had passed and left her nothing to do but feel it. You didn't shoot a single man, Silas said quietly, looking at her. I told you once I wouldn't be part of the pile guns leave behind. She looked at the burning wagon, at the wall of flame that had done more to end the fight than any bullet could have. I meant it. They stood together in the settling dust, the fire slowly burning itself down, and somewhere far off through the haze, the first gray hint of a clearing sky was already beginning to show along the eastern horizon. The dust had mostly settled by the time the sun came up, though the yard still carried the marks of what had happened there. Scorched earth where the wagon had stood. A few dark shapes in the dirt that Clara would have to see properly buried once the day allowed for it. Blackwood himself sat against the porch post where Silas had tied him, wrists bound, his fine coat torn and gray with soot, saying nothing at all, now that the fight had gone fully out of him. Leo came out onto the porch first, rubbing sleep from eyes that hadn't gotten much rest, and stopped short at the sight of the tycoon, sitting bound, not 10 feet from where he stood. Is it really over? Close to it, Clara said, pulling him into her side. Judge Ellery's riding hard for the Capitol right now. Once the marshals get here with him, it'll be over proper. They didn't have to wait long. By mid-morning, the sound of horses came up the farm road, more riders than Blackwood had brought the night before, and for one bad second, Clara's hand went to the rifle, propped by the door out of pure instinct before she saw the badges catching the light. Federal marshals, and riding at their head, dust-covered but upright in his saddle, Judge Ellery himself. Made it faster than I expected, Silas said, stepping down to meet them. Wire lines cooperated for once, Ellery said, swinging down off his horse with the stiffness of a man who'd ridden through most of a night to get there. His eyes moved past Silas to the bound figure on the porch, and something satisfied settled into his weathered face. Well now, looks like you two saved us the trouble of hunting him down. He came to us, Clara said, brought most of his hired men with him too. Storm took care of the rest. Ellery walked over and looked down at Blackwood a long moment, the ledger still tucked under his own arm, water-stained pages and all. Thaddeus Blackwood, I've read every page of what you've been running in this county. Stolen deeds, bribed judges, a dead deputy who found his conscience one day too late to save his own life, but not too late to bring you down anyway. Ellery's voice didn't rise, didn't need to. You'll answer for all of it in a courtroom that isn't yours to buy. Blackwood said nothing. There wasn't anything left in him to say. The marshals took him off his hands within the hour, loaded onto a wagon with 2 men riding guard on either side, and Clara watched him go without any triumph in it, only a tired kind of relief that came from finally setting down a weight she'd been carrying for longer than she'd let herself admit. Ellery lingered after the wagon pulled away, standing in the yard with his hat in his hands, looking at the scorched earth and the charred remains of the barn, still standing black against the morning sky. "You two have been through a war out here," he said. "Something like one," Silas agreed. Ellery's eyes moved to the wanted poster, still folded in his saddlebag, the old one with Silas's likeness printed rough across it, and he studied it a long moment before he spoke again. "I've read the whole story now, Mr. Vance, not just the ledger, the deputy's own testimony, what little he managed to give me before he died, about a valley in Texas 5 years back, and an order a decent man refused to follow. I've also heard what you did in this county since, standing between a widow and armed men more times than I care to count, talking a scared deputy into finding his conscience, holding a rifle steady on a ridge so an unarmed woman could save lives Blackwood's own foreman wouldn't lift a finger for. None of that erases desertion, Judge." "No," Ellery agreed. "It doesn't erase it, but it does put it in a different light than the one that poster was printed under." He folded his hands behind his back, considering. "I've got a choice to make here, and I expect you know it same as I do. I could send you back to Texas to answer for desertion charges that are 5 years cold and built on an order that never should have been given in the first place. Might be that's still the letter of the law." Clara stepped forward, unable to hold back any longer. "Judge," Ellery raised a hand, not unkindly, "I'm not finished. Mrs. Hayes." He looked back at Silas. "Or I could do something else. This county just lost the only law it had, corrupt as it was. It's going to need a sheriff. And before every debt Blackwood manufactured turns into a fight over who inherits the mess he left behind. I need a man in that position who understands exactly what it costs to refuse an unjust order, and exactly what it costs to do right when doing right isn't easy or safe. I've watched you do both these past weeks, whether you meant for me to see it or not." Silas stood very still, the weight of the offer settling slow across his face. "You're asking a wanted man to wear a badge. I'm asking a good man to wear one," Ellery said. "The badge doesn't care what came before it, Mr. Vance. Only what a man does with it once it's pinned on. I think you already know that better than most, given what you told a certain deputy about the weight of tin stars not so long ago." He held out the silver star, plain and unpolished. Nothing like the crooked badge the foreman at the railroad camp had worn with such carelessness. "Your choice. Hang for a desertion charge that never should have existed, or pin this on and make sure nothing like Blackwood ever takes root in this county again." Silas looked at the star a long moment, then at Clara, standing in the morning light with Leo close against her side, the farm behind them scarred but standing. The whole of what they'd built together these past weeks laid out plain in front of him. He thought of Maria, and the valley, and the 5 years he'd spent believing himself unfit to carry anything as heavy as a badge ever again. He thought of what Clara had told him in a kitchen with his back laid bare in the morning light, about scars and wounds, and the choice a person gets to make about which one a thing becomes. He took the star. "I'll wear it," he said. "Not for the government, not even for the badge itself. I'll wear it because I've got something here worth protecting now. And I don't intend to run from that fight the way I ran from the last one." Ellery nodded, satisfied, and pinned the star to Silas's coat himself, the silver, catching the morning sun bright against the canvas. "Sheriff Vance," he said, "county's in your hands now. Try not to burn any more barns down in the process." "No promises," Silas said, and for the first time in longer than Clara could remember, something like a real smile crossed his face. The marshals rode out within the hour, taking Blackwood with them toward whatever courtroom would finally hold him accountable. And the farm settled slow into a quiet that felt different than any quiet that had come before it. Not the tense, waiting kind of quiet they'd lived under for weeks. Something steadier, something that felt, for the first time, like it might actually last. They spent the following days rebuilding what the fire had taken. New lumber going up where the barn used to stand. Neighbors from town arriving one by one once word spread that Blackwood was gone for good. Hands they hadn't dared offer before now freely given. Deputy Harlan Reed was buried on a low rise behind the house. Under a cottonwood tree, with a marker, Silas carved himself that read simply, he chose right, at the end. On the morning the new fence finally stood finished, cedar posts pale and strong against the horizon. Clara found Silas standing at the gap where the last section had once separated them. The silver star, bright on his coat, in the soft morning light. You're not on that side anymore, she said, coming to stand beside him. No, he agreed. I'm not. He wrapped an arm around her, and she leaned into it, watching Leo run along the finished fence line with a dog they'd taken in after the fire. Some stray that had wandered up looking for scraps and stayed on account of a boy who couldn't help but feed anything that needed feeding. The land stretched out wide around them, scarred in places still, but healing the way land does when it's given enough time and enough hands willing to work it. Somewhere behind them, the county was already starting to right itself. Honest men stepping into places Blackwood's corruption had hollowed out. A fresh start settling slow over a place that had needed one for longer than anybody wanted to admit. Clara looked up at the sky, wide and open and entirely their own now, and understood, in a way she hadn't quite let herself before, that some debts get paid not through vengeance, but through the simple, stubborn choice to keep building something worth protecting, one fence post at a time. And so as the morning sun rose over the Hayes farm, it did not shine upon a perfect place. The barn was still scarred by fire. The yard still carried the marks of violence. Graves stood beneath the cottonwood tree, reminding everyone that victory had come at a painful cost. Yet the farm was standing. Clara was standing. Leo was safe. And Silas Vance, once hunted as an outlaw, now wore a sheriff's star over his heart. Not because the past had been erased, but because he had finally chosen to stop running from it. That may be the greatest lesson this story leaves with us. Our past can explain us, but it does not have to define us. For 5 years, Silas believed that one terrible failure had made him unworthy of peace, love, or forgiveness. He had refused an unjust order, yet he still blamed himself for the lives he could not save. He carried his guilt like an open wound, moving from town to town, afraid that staying anywhere would allow others to see the broken man beneath the hard exterior. But when he walked out of Clara's barn, wounded and outnumbered, to protect a widow and a child he had never met, he revealed who he truly was. He was not the coward he believed himself to be. He was a man whose conscience had survived everything the world had done to him. Many people carry wounds like Silas did. They replay old decisions, lost opportunities, painful mistakes, and moments when they wish they had been stronger. They punish themselves for not knowing then what they understand now. But a person cannot return to yesterday and rewrite it. The only power we truly possess is the choice we make today. Silas could not save Maria or the families in that Texas valley, but he could protect Clara, Leo, the railroad workers, and an entire county from suffering the same injustice. He could turn guilt into purpose. He could allow an old wound to become a scar instead of letting it bleed for the rest of his life. Clara teaches us another kind of courage. Her strength did not come from cruelty, anger, or a desire for revenge. It came from compassion. She saved Silas before she knew whether he deserved saving. She treated injured laborers as human beings when Blackwood's men saw them only as disposable workers. She stood against armed men while refusing to surrender the values that made her different from them. Even during the final battle, Clara did not aim her rifle at another person. She fired at the kerosene wagon, creating enough chaos to stop the attack without becoming what she hated. Her actions remind us that kindness is not weakness. Mercy is not surrender. Compassion does not mean allowing evil to continue without resistance. Sometimes the gentlest person in the room is also the strongest, because that person has learned how to fight without losing their humanity. Thaddeus Blackwood controlled the county through fear, money, false debts, and corrupted laws. He believed that power came from owning land, judges, deputies, and desperate men. Yet his empire collapsed because ordinary people slowly stopped being afraid. A widow refused to surrender her farm. An outlaw chose to defend strangers. A frightened deputy listened to his conscience. Railroad workers saw that someone valued their lives. Neighbors finally stepped forward to help rebuild what violence had destroyed. Blackwood did not fall because one hero defeated him alone. He fell because courage became contagious. All elements within this narrative are fictional and crafted for storytelling purposes. The author bears no intention of referencing real people, cultures, or events in a literal sense. Readers are encouraged to engage with the work as a piece of creative expression rather than documented reality.